Hi, I'm Mark Edwards and welcome to the Channel Zone, your IT channel podcast. With me today is Ed Kenny, a veteran of the IT industry, who's going to give us some insights, some thoughts, some perspectives, and his view of the future of selling within the channel. I have always found, I don't know whether you'd agree with me on this, Ed, but salespeople didn't really start off in life planning to go into sales. Footballers always wanted to be footballers. Doctors typically always wanted to be doctors. But I don't think I've ever come across somebody that always wanted to get into sales. Most of us wanted to do something else. I think I can see a guitar behind you there. There's guitars behind me here as well. So that might have been part of your vision of the future as a youngster growing up. But tell me, how did you get, tell the listeners here, how did you get into sales? What was the initial entree into the business?
So as a youngster, actually, I always worked in shops to earn some additional money. And so I had I enjoyed working with people from that point of view. I guess I learned the whole thing about exchanging goods for money at quite an early age. But you're right, my first chosen career, I went to university and that didn't last terribly long. Drink and all sorts of things got in the way of my interest in maths. Theoretical physics was my chosen subject. I then got distracted by photography, and that was a big hobby of mine when I was a youngster. And I ended up training as a professional photographer and working in the photographic industry for probably 5 or 6 years, both in Ireland and in the UK. And in fact, it was photography that took me from Dublin over to London and then Bristol. But one of the things I kind of figured out fairly early on was that you had to be really, really good at it to make a decent living. And I'm slightly visually impaired.
Aren't we all?
So photography whilst it was really interesting and an exciting business to be in, I was never going to be brilliant at it. And whilst I was working in one of the laboratories, the photographic studios in London, down in Wimbledon, off Warple Road, I met a few of the sales guys who used to come in and sell stuff to this big laboratory, and I thought, that looks pretty easy. They get to wear fancy suits and drive nice cars
car
and all
outside.
The rest of it. Yeah, so I thought I did my first mail shot to 20 of the big photographic organisations in the UK, and said, I'm good with people. I've got a good interest in photography. I'd probably like to consider a change from the technical creative area into the commercial area. And a couple of people offered me jobs, and the rest is history, as they say. So I ended up working for a company in St Albans who manufacture big photographic machines for the big film companies, as they were back in the day. And I did that for a couple of years. I then, because I'd studied a bit of computing at university, I spotted an opportunity to work for a local company, computer company, who manufactured or created software and bought and sold second-hand Burroughs computing equipment.
Burroughs is a name, a blast from the past.
Absolutely. So I went to meet the MD, and we hit it off, and I went to work for those guys. And it was then I learned, the huge difference between my perception of value as a seller of second-hand equipment and a buyer's perception of value who's never had this flash thing before. And we made lots of money and had lots of happy customers out of doing that.
So what does that mean? Did the customer perceive greater value in the kit or in the software than you did, or than the company did? They perceived it as being really valuable. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's a bit like, when I've owned something for 3 or 4 years, a car or a guitar or whatever, my perception of its value goes down because of familiarity, and I know it's failures and this and that and the
Yes.
other. Whereas if I polish it up and put it on Facebook Marketplace or something like that, somebody else, it's going to be a new toy to them, and their perception of value is much higher. So that's kind of how the second-hand marketplace worked.
And you were in that for how long before making the move to you-know-who?
Probably about, I was probably there about 3 years. And along the way, I met my wife, Belinda, because she worked also for the MD at that time. So it was kind of a happy period of my life. I met some really good friends who I'm still friends with at that organisation. I then, they got into some financial trouble, you know, as SMBs often do. They took on fancy premises and more staff and all the rest of it. So you know the story.
I do, unfortunately. Playing house, I think they say sometimes they call it. As you said, just going out and buying all of the accoutrements that you think make the business. But of course, that's all they tend to do is drag the business down. They're generally an expense, an overhead that then has to be paid for.
Absolutely, especially the fancy offices, you know, because it just dramatically increasing your overheads. So I went from there to another organisation who sold second-hand equipment, an electronic equipment organisation called Microlease, who I believe are still in business. Excuse me. And I did more or less the same thing for them. The difference was I joined right at the beginning of that side of the business, and you know we grew it from nothing to quite a substantial business. So I was there for a couple of years.
I'm assuming Ed, there was a financial element to that. It was basically finance agreements, lease agreements. Was it on computer equipment?
Yeah. Well, their primary business was rental of electronic testing equipment like oscilloscopes and such like. And it's a huge business in the UK, quite specialised, because these items are very expensive to buy and you tend to only need them for a short period in the production cycle when you're testing stuff out. So we ended up with stuff that had been used for several years, and then they just wanted to turn it over to get the new stuff. So again, we were able to sell that to both in the UK, in Europe, and into the States. So
short-term rentals.
Well, the main business of the company was short-term rentals. My job was to sell on the stuff that was kind of 2 or 3 years old, so we could buy the new stuff.
Gotcha. So where did CC appear in the CV or in your trajectory?
So I went to a small reseller in Cambridge after that, who eventually got bought by Corporate Computers, who got bought by Compel in Welwyn Garden City. And then Computacenter came knocking on the door in 1991, I think, or 1990. And I went to Computacenter, where I stayed for nearly 20 years.
20 years there, but maybe, say, if it's from 1991 to where we are now, you're talking 30-odd years in the channel. So from all of that time, all of the experience, what would you say are the key attributes of a good salesperson or a sales leader, whichever is perhaps more pertinent? What do you think?
So now I think a relentless focus on customer success. So, and what I mean, and I know that sounds awfully twee and all the rest of it, but if you start from that point of view, how can I help my customer to be successful? Then you just can't go wrong.
That book, I think, Helping Customers Succeed, had perhaps a major impact on you, and that's probably about, I would say that's 15, maybe 20 years ago.
At least.
But I remember at the time it was, you recommended it then, but you still, that seemingly, maybe you've taken that on board, a relentless focus on customer success.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always worked for me.
Fantastic.
Since I kind of figured that out. The other attributes that you'll see, that I always see in really successful people, is great focus on detail, very, very goal driven. So I've always been very goal driven.
Right.
A need to succeed.
What kind of goals, though, Ed? What kind of goals? Because I'm in the same process here. I think you can call it goals. Incentives is the key, isn't it? I saw a quote last week, I think, from, I can't remember if it was Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, his partner, but the whole point was, show me the incentives, yeah, and I'll show you the activities and I'll show you the results. So I don't know, is it the same when you say goal-driven? How would you, is the goal the incentive? Is the goal what you're going to get out at the end of from the commission check? Or is it a business goal even on behalf of the customer? Can you get juiced over that?
Well, it can be all of those things, really. So with some of the customers I worked with, I was on site, so part of the customer team, for probably 3 or 4 days a week. And, you almost get to a point where you're thinking like the customer and you absorb their objectives and goals. And you start to celebrate the success that they achieve and the role that you play in that success. So it becomes that enmeshed. And for me, they're the very best customer relationships.
And there's an environment issue there as well, from what you're saying. You know what I mean? As you said, that is, you're in the customer's offices working with them. That alone, whether it's by osmosis or some other method, but you basically pick up on their values, their goals, their objectives. Yeah,
and the first time I did it was at Cellnet, now O2 or now something else. I don't know what they're called these days.
Yeah, Virgin Media O2, I think it is now, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and we'd secured a services contract, which meant we had 30 or 40 people on site doing technical work. And I was on site as the overall lead, sales guy, etc., etc. And I spent all my time talking with the customer about what it was they wanted to achieve, often at quite a trivial level. How can we get this mouse from here to the PA of the MD, or some major kind of transformation. So they would share with me their strategic objectives, and then we would try and fit in with what those strategic objectives were. And honestly, that's the very, very best way of selling. Because you're not really selling at all.
No, that's what it sounds like to me. It's more like you're there, I wouldn't call it servant, but it is servant selling in some respects. You're not in there pitching, probably are giving them some ideas and some insights, but it sounds like you want to kind of serve their needs, which is very subtle. Very subtle, Ed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going back to the question, what is it that makes successful people in sales, and what is this thing about goal setting? Now, I've always done, since I read The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People,
yes,
which is the other book that had an enormous impact on me.
Same company too, Ed. It's both of those come out of Covey.
That's true. Yes, I hadn't. Yes. So since I read that, I kind of think about the whole selling profession as a process that anybody can learn. And that was joy to me, because I'm by nature an introvert, and traditional sales, the image of salespeople is kind of gregarious and outgoing and all the rest of it. But I'd chosen this career, and actually I was really, really enjoying it. And people who knew me well back in the day said, never thought of you as a sales guy. But it's really interesting. There's a great study, Harvard Business Study, which looks at the key attributes of salespeople. And the first one that sits on top of the list is modesty and believe it or not, lack of gregariousness. So I found that
complete counterpoint to, as you said, to what is typically maybe associated. A lot of people find, as I said, would find salespeople very loud, very often charismatic, outgoing.
Yep.
But this review says the complete opposite.
Says the complete opposite. I'll send it to you. You can probably.
I'm not sure I would agree, but there we go. How does that fit in now then? Because you've studied, you've gone back to university, so you were the classic dropout back in the day. You're saying when you first went to uni, but you've gone back at this stage in your life and studied psychology. So how was that fed into, or how does that speak to your thoughts now about business in general, and let's say sales and sales leadership in particular?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to be able to retire earlier than normal, and it was something I wanted to do. And one of the things that I'd always had an interest in was psychology, and actually selling is psychology in action. It really is, because if you don't understand people, you're not going to succeed in any kind of customer interaction. And the more you understand about people and what motivates them and what motivates yourself, then the better you're going to be. Because, as I said earlier, I firmly believe it's about really understanding what is it that's going to help your customer be successful at a personal and business level. So, psychology was, for me, it was on one of my goal lists. I must do a degree in psychology.
Right.
And also, there's a bit of, I should have stayed at university when I was a youngster. I should have completed that and see where it went to, because there's a bit of an academic in me, and I wanted to see what it was like. As it turned out, so I completed my degree, and at UEA, University of East Anglia, so top university. It was a great experience. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way, so it turned from a face-to-face on campus to an online experience, which wasn't really what I wanted. And psychology as a subject is very wide, very broad, and quite dry, actually, although it sounds quite exciting. Practical psychology is really quite exciting, but there's a lot of statistics and all that stuff involved, which is... But the thing that I got really excited about in studying psychology was... so when people think about mental health and such like, they think about poor mental health. It's all about, I've got depression, or this, that and the other. There really isn't a great deal of positive mental health activity, and there's a whole school of thought that's come up in the past 20 years called positive psychology, and it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's very, very relevant to salespeople, number one, but just for everybody. So if you think about your physical health, and I know you do a lot, and we think about physical health in both positive and negative ways. So we think about ailments and such like, and how we can fix them, visual aids like glasses and such like. But we also spend a lot of time, some of us do spend a lot of time creating better health, so going to the gym or cycling or running or eating better or whatever. The problem with mental health is that balance isn't there. People spend far too much time focused on, I feel terrible and depressed, etc., instead of doing all the positive stuff.
Not as proactive. And again, I'm a lot on Twitter. I don't know if you use Twitter, but that can be. I don't know if you've heard the term doom scrolling. It can literally, if you've ever seen. I don't know what the proposed Twitter feed is. Literally one article after another, one opinion after the other that are often, I suppose it's the algorithm, I think, is picking up on what's intriguing, but I've purposefully gone out of my way recently to put into the algorithm stuff outside of that realm, not the political stuff, a lot more music and a lot more culture, rather than focusing on the political environment and so on. Because again, you could spend, I don't know what your consumption of social media is, but if I look at, when I travel in and out of London on the train, I mean, everybody is on their phone, even from the ticket instructor, the ticket guy at the train station, who seemingly, when I'm buying my ticket, feels that I'm interrupting him from scrolling on his phone, to the guy who takes the ticket at the kiosk, onto the train, and everybody is kind of fixed on that screen.
Let's hope the driver isn't.
Well, he's probably the one Oh dear, I hadn't had that thought before, Ed.
So one of the things psychologists talk about is the echo chamber that we create around us. And all that means simplistically is, in a social media environment, we tend to follow people who think like we do, who have similar opinions, etc., etc. So we get an echo of our own view all the time.
Yeah.
So I mean, I consciously read the Telegraph and the Guardian and, as many of the papers as I can, scan read them, just to try and get a slightly more balanced view on politics in particular.
As you said, scan read. Have you found that your ability to actually sit down and take in a long form article, has that, whether you're still book reading to the extent, again, I think a lot of us are finding that you want to take information now in bite-sized chunks rather than the longer articles. So when you say skim or scan read, that's what that kind of says to me. Agree?
Absolutely.
Not?
Yeah. And we tend to use up the kind of spare spaces in our lives now better.
That's right.
To absorb information. So, listening to podcasts when you're out walking, or doom scrolling when, you're waiting for a train, or, whatever. I mean, I consciously put that away and read books. And again, being goal-driven, I kind of tick myself off with how many books I read. That I buy. I tend to read them on the Kindle because they're easier on my eyes. They're less satisfying to own because, with a typical book, you remember the cover. When you read it on the Kindle, you don't really see the cover. But, psychology can teach us quite a bit, but you have to fight your way through, all the different branches and such like.
So if you were starting your sales career now, having done a degree in psychology, how do you think your approach would differ compared to the approach that you've taken in the past? Do you think you'd enter the profession differently?
Well, I entered it by chance, as most of us have done.
Yeah. We fall in or we fail into sales, as I've often said. You try to go down one path, whatever, there's an obstacle in the way, you take an alternative approach, and all of a sudden, like yourself and like myself, you find yourself in a kind of sales position. For some of us, it works out perfectly. For others, maybe not so. But I said, you've been 30-odd years in the profession, very, very successfully. Not only at the, as I said, we've touched upon, I think, the introduction into CC, into Computacenter in the early 90s, but you did also, bear in mind this is a channel zone podcast, give us some insight also then into the vendor, because I did work at CC myself. That's my one kind of experience in the reseller, as I would have called it then, the value-added reseller. I don't think they use that term anymore so much. Everyone's a partner nowadays. But most of the work I've done in the last, let's say, 15 years has really been with vendors. Now, you did a sizable spell, I think, at a vendor. Can you just give the listeners an idea, how would you see the differences and the similarities in those two fields?
Yeah, so I worked for EMC for 5 years, and I don't think they'd mind the description at all of being a very typical US quarterly focused technology company. And I've used the word relentless once already today. EMC, organizations like EMC, and of course they're now part of Dell, were relentlessly and are still relentlessly focused on quarterly targets and the achievement of quarterly targets. And we used to joke that, each quarter was 9 weeks of prospecting and 4 weeks of closing. But, what I learned, the difference between the vendor and the channel organizations for me is the channel are much more customer focused because they're closer to the customer. And so they have to, if you're in the channel, you have to go and listen to the customer and understand what they need and then find stuff that'll satisfy that need. In the process, beating off several competitors who are offering the same product at even thinner margins. So that's the game. And then, how the channel has changed really is that they've layered services on top of that. And that's where the primary focus it probably is. But the in the vendor, what for me as a sales guy, what I learned in the vendor was ruthless qualification. So, when we did deal reviews, there were 3 questions. When you talk about a deal, the 3 questions were, why now? So why is the customer doing it now?
Yep.
And, we would spend a great deal of time on why now? Why are they doing it? And then it will be, why us? So why are we the correct solution to what it is they want to do? And then finally, what next? And we would just go through each deal based on those 3 questions. And I can't fault that approach in terms of trying to close a sales deal.
Right. But the why now, I don't know what kind of answers and responses you would have. If you think about it, what is the seller looking? What kind of answer do you want for that? You want them to buy now, typically. You don't want the answer to be, well, actually, they could buy in 6 months' time, or they could buy this 9 months from now. Were you trying to construct the rationale to take the customer as to why they needed to buy it now? Because, again, you say quarterly focused. This has always been the... So a strange way of looking at it, I know, but it's like it's as if tech vendors and everybody in the channel is kind of looking for the deals to close at that point. It's not necessarily the customer's decision or desire to buy it in the final, what did you say, 2 or 3 weeks of that quarter.
2 or 3 hours.
I've always found that a bit of an odd... Yes, correct. And as it is said, it does ramp up dramatically to the point where it's crazy in the last couple of days, or what you're saying there, in the last couple of hours even, often, when you're trying to drive through. But is that selling? That's a lot of that goes on. That's within the channel itself. I wonder as to whether... Are you telling me that customers are signing paperwork right at the very last moment of that quarter, or is it paperwork within the channel that is passing back and forth? The distributor, the reseller, the vendor. It's an
all
incredible... yes.
So
how that affects the why now, as I said, the why now, I'm intrigued by that. Is that why now from our perspective or from the customer's perspective?
So it's a form of qualification. And actually, if I learned one thing from being at the vendor, it's qualify everything. Because you've only got so much time and you've got 30 leads, qualify them down to 3. When you ask the why now, so if you say to me I'm interested in buying a car, and I said why now, well, I quite fancy it. Well, that's not a hot lead for me.
No.
Well, it may be.
Yes.
But if you say, well, I just crashed the other one, then okay, that's a compelling reason. So it's really just a way of filing.
Compelling event, that's right, and the compelling reason.
Yeah. it's trying to find the thing that makes this real. But if the customer said, and when we were selling big disk array type things, and trying to find the reason why now was critically important, because you could spend 6 months, a year, 2 years, and never close the deal. But if there's a big project in the offing, and then you understand where this piece of equipment fits in the project timeline, well, it has to be done. If you can see the project plan, which goes to one of the other things that I think is really important for good salespeople, which is selling at all levels, talking to all sorts of people, not just, if you can get to the CEO, great, but he doesn't do the project plan. So if you understand where that piece of kit fits in the plan, January the 31st, happens to be my birthday, by the way, so happy days. But, if they've got to install that piece of kit on 31st of January, then you've got a good chance of selling it in December. So
in terms of
it's a really powerful question. Sorry.
Yeah, what about selling into procurement? I'm intrigued on what were your engagements like in that area? Did you like selling to procurement, or would you try to? A lot of salespeople will try and avoid procurement. Would you agree?
Well, they're necessary in the chain, So, and increasingly, the bigger organisation you go to, I may be generalising here, but the bigger organisation you go to, the more involved the procurement people are in the end-to-end process. And so, some of the very large government organisations I worked with, the procurement director will be hand in hand with the CIO. And the procurement guy would understand the technology, not as well as the CIO, but, so some people describe them as a necessary evil. The really smart procurement people work very closely with the selling organisations. One, to get the best commercials, but two, to ensure that what they're getting actually does the job, because most decisions in big organisations tend to be committee decisions. And so the people who are involved all have a view, and the procurement people at a senior level tend to have a pretty strong and clear view of what the right solution is.
So definitely, I don't know whether you've ever taken a proposition to procurement we can deliver some operational benefit, or we can deliver greater value to your organisation, which I suppose is another way of saying we might be able to help you reduce the cost. Have we ever done that?
So absolutely, yeah. So I guess you can go to procurement and say, we'll save you money here. That's a fairly crude way of doing it. A better way of doing it is, a lot of these people are careerists, if that's the right word.
Yes.
And they're looking for wins. So again, going back to helping your customer succeed, how can I help my procurement guy to look better in his organisation? Well, I can give him a win. I can say to him, have you thought about doing things in this way? And you've got to have a pretty comfortable relationship with them to be able to talk to them about new stuff. And what you're talking about there is taking a new proposition to them. If you have that relationship, then you can do that, and you can help the guy and help him sell it internally. Not the best way of doing it, getting somebody else to sell on your behalf, but sometimes it's worth him floating the idea in amongst his peers in the customer organisation, and then you might get an invite to present it or talk to somebody else. And this is one of the, circling back a little bit, this is one of the weaknesses in the why now type qualification, right? Because, really, really clever salespeople or astute salespeople will be finding opportunities that the customer doesn't even know exists. They'll be creating new requirements that, the customer wasn't aware of. And, the situations where you create those requirements can often be the very best pieces of business that you do. something I know you're absolutely switched into, because your people, I guess, don't know they need whiteboard selling training until
it's not as
you
if
don't talk to them.
That's right. Although I said any inquiry coming in is usually they've come to the conclusion they know what you can do with the whiteboard, so they come with the requirement for it. But ultimately, you do need to find out what is it they're trying to do. What's the purpose behind it?
Sure.
You don't buy a whiteboard just because you want to buy a whiteboard. It ultimately has to feed into some other objective, whether that is, I don't know, we got a new product that's being launched, or we want more deals registered within the business, or we've got a big incentive or program taking place. This would be one contributory element to it.
Yeah, but you might,
yes.
I suspect you might even have a conversation with a customer which says to them, do you know how efficient your sales teams are? And do you know what your closing
What do you think the
rate
answers? Well, those are... have I ever given you my BDQ before? You've heard my BDQ concept, which is the billion-dollar question. My opening line has been since 2008. Has to be presented at a whiteboard, by the way, so you're on your feet, in a meeting room, possibly with 1 or 2 or 3 people from the customer organisation, but I'm on my feet at a whiteboard and I draw it out on the whiteboard as I deliver the billion-dollar question. But the billion-dollar question, in summary, is what percentage of your sales force can confidently deliver your value proposition? 2, let's say a C-level audience, which is where most of them say they want to be able to sell at.
Yeah.
What percentage? And what do you think the most common answer is to that? If I'm talking to a sales leader within an organisation, what percentage of your sales force can confidently deliver your value proposition at C level, let's say? What do you think the most common answer is?
15%.
Yeah, it is. Well, you're virtually spot on. 20%, I would say, is probably the most common. 15, 20, 25%. Yeah. I've even had one in the US, he went duck eggs, as in kind of 0.
He's a new guy who's going to sweep them all out, is he?
Oh, absolutely. But if you think about it, 15 to 20%, and yet you could follow that up. I mean, it's quite a painful revelation, isn't it? The IT sales organisation, the IT sales professional is a very expensive resource. Very expensive, and yet you can then turn around and say that only 15 to 20% of your sales force can confidently deliver the proposition. Part of that, I've always said, is because the portfolio now that the salesperson has to master is just so they can't master it. It's just too great. If you think of the time when you were working as at a reseller, you've got that entire portfolio of product. In comparison to, my guess is, Ed, back in your early days when it was the photographic equipment, when you were selling there, you might have been able to master a piece of kit. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
There might have been one piece of technology which you knew inside out. You knew all its use cases. You knew how it worked. You could possibly even, as I would have been in my early days with a photocopier, you could even take the thing apart and put it back together again. So we learned back in the 80s, you learned to sell targeted and focused on one piece of equipment, a certain sector of either a territory or a business vertical, for instance. But it was very, very specific to one piece of kit. Once you'd mastered that and you could sell it, then maybe you took on 2 or 3 in the portfolio. But I just feel for the salesperson today joining an organisation, straight in. And services, professional services, all of the technology, hardware, software, security, cyber. Think of the myriad components to that overall proposition. It's breathtaking.
Yeah, but there's kind of 2 takeaways from that. One is, back in the day, you and I were almost technical salespeople, in that we knew that, you could take the thing apart and you knew how it worked and all the rest of it. Now, because of the huge range of products and services, I think the sales guy's job is to make the complex simple and kind of align the customer with a view that in this complicated world, this guy here can give me access to all sorts of things that are going to help me do my business better. And, going back to what makes great salespeople, the ones who use the team most effectively,
yes,
and manage to orchestrate that team at the appropriate times, they're the people who really, really win.
But that's
being able to.
I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. As you said, you've got true leverage then. So yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. Listen, coming to the end of our time here, what's the most valuable, if you haven't covered it already, what would you say is the most valuable kind of piece of advice or lesson that you've learned in your sales career going forwards? All right, what's the most valuable lesson?
All the stuff I've covered.
Everything we've covered.
Be optimistic. Be optimistic.
So if you were to wind the clock back and you could meet yourself first day at Computacenter back in, when was that? Was that in the 1980s or 1990s? If you could meet,
early 90s.
If you had a time machine and you could take yourself back then, what one piece of advice would you give to yourself starting off in your reseller sales career? What advice would you give to your younger self?
Without question, spend as much time as possible with the really successful people.
Yeah.
That would be my, and I did do that, but not, I could have done it more.
We could have done it more if you'd have been based in Blackfriars, was my kind of feeling. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. I didn't want to say be in head office, because that kind of sounds...
Well, I went and saw, a number of years ago, over the years, I've been to see lots of business speakers and more. I've seen Stephen Covey in the past and many, many others. But I went to see that guy from The Wolf of Wall Street. I don't know, I can't remember it. Jordan something, I can't remember his surname. But I have always felt, because I pay to go to these events, I've always felt it's worthwhile, whether it's hundreds of pounds or thousands of pounds, if I come away with one piece of information. As far as I'm concerned, one insight has massive potential value. But one of the things that I came away from his talk with, he said, put yourself in the proximity of what it is that you want. So that's pretty much another way of saying exactly what you're saying there. You need to be in the proximity of it. As is, I also, and this would have affected you too, if you think, I don't know whether you're from Dublin or whether you're from a rural part of
Dublin
of Ireland, right? But it may, and I don't know what Dublin was like in the 1980s, but I was in Wales, remember, in the 1980s, selling musical instruments in a retail environment. Business, the opportunities for me down there were very thin on the ground. The place was basically jobs for life. There were very few opportunities appearing. Having then, like yourself, I met Wendy, my wife as she is now, moved from Swansea to London. All of a sudden I could have 5 or 6 interviews in a day, and I got my first opportunity as a business-to-business salesperson selling photocopiers in. Check it out again. Look at the luck here. I ended up, my territory, I often refer to this, EC1R, EC1M, EC2R and EC2Y. It's terrible to think that I know sub-postal districts to such a degree in London, but oddly enough, even later today, I'm probably going to find myself near Farringdon Station, which is the centre of the universe for me. But if my territory hadn't been there, but if my territory had been Cambridgeshire or Bedfordshire, or somewhere else, very, very different. So the proximity, as you said, and spend your time with the people that are successful. Again, would you agree, and we'll finish on this, given the change in the way that people are working nowadays, young people coming into the sales environment, working from home. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's risky, unless, and it will, when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked, as your friend Buffett said. I think this whole hybrid working is going to create that dividing line between the highly motivated, potentially very successful people and the also-rans. I really think that. But, it is because the smart people will be listening to the great podcasts that are available and such like. you know.
You mean the Channel Zone?
The other guys...
Absolutely.
Listen, I was on my bike doing my Keep Fit yesterday morning, and I listened to the Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart podcast. And who do they have on? Who do they have on for nearly an hour? Bill Gates.
All right.
I mean, you know,
was it good?
It was fantastic.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
Quite a challenging interview, actually, because they put him under some pressure, and you just couldn't get access to that kind of stuff back in the day. So it's all there, but going back to psychology, it's about personal motivation. You have to seek it out and consume it.
The resources available to people now, as you said, back in the day. Well, there was certainly before the internet, but you could buy books, but then you generally had to buy them. You had to source them. You could, again, what you didn't have, exactly. You didn't have an Amazon providing you with you had bookshops you could go to, or you could have personal recommendations from other people. But again, you've seen the growth of the internet since, let's say, the mid-1990s. But I've just recently also then started using AI. I don't know if you've used ChatGPT. The things that can do with regards to even just helping you craft an email or write a proposal. You can make a draft of something, put it in and say, elevate this, give it a more professional feel, make it more persuasive, and it can take that away and in 10 seconds come back with an alternative. Now, some musicians out there are criticizing this because it takes away from the creativity, maybe in the discipline that a craftsman needs to have with regards to his craft. This is kind of making it a little bit kind of easy. It's just like popping toast in a toaster in some respects, and out comes the finished product. I had a demonstration a few weeks ago on and it's a generative AI, but a proposal writing generative AI platform, which will take an RFP. Do you know what I mean? You feed the RFP in, and it will consume all of that, assess it, analyze it, respond as required or requested in the RFP, taking into account your organization's values and your mission statements and whatever else information you've got out there, that it's available to the AI platform, and come back with a proposal. You can then say, make it more detailed, condense it, it's done, translate it into French, Spanish, and it comes out as if it's written by one person. One of the big challenges I've always thought, if you think about multiple inputs into a proposal, is that they don't read particularly well, because this paragraph was written by person A, this paragraph by somebody completely different. They're working with one another, but it's two different perspectives, two different authors. This thing cleans all of that out. So last question, Ed. I think I've already said last question once, but how do you think the sales world is going to change going forwards from here? What do you see as being the big changes and advances? Yeah,
so I think there'll be more of that stuff that you're talking about. And I tend to be very positive about AI, because in my humble view, it raises the bar for all of us. And so whilst it might squirt out a proposal, 3 or 4 companies might submit that proposal as the AI produced it. The other one may take that as a base level and add some additional creativity to it and some additional spins and all the rest of it, and so they'll win. So it's a pyramid of growing knowledge is how I see that. And actually Bill Gates talks a lot about AI on that podcast that I referenced to. Yeah,
well, look, really I'm going to check that. I'm going to check that out. Thank you very much for spending some time on the Channel Zone here today. Really appreciate it. And hey, listen, all the best. Look forward to speaking again in the not too distant future.
Take care.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. That was the Channel Zone, your IT channel podcast. Come back and see us again soon. Until then, all the best.